This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News. This week's featured stories, like all that we publish at the Heartland Daily News, provide information and analysis about breaking public policy events and issues that affect your life, your health, your freedoms, and the nation's economy. This week we have 3 news stories for you, and there's some good news. We're going to cover a report from Time magazine on election issues, and then we're going to talk about some good news for Minneapolis and Kansas. So since we have some good news, let's start with that and jump right in with the story out of Minneapolis. In the wake of a significant increase in crime that's followed cuts to the city's police presence implemented last summer, the Minneapolis City Council has decided to increase the number of police officers patrolling the city, instead of decreasing it further, as some had advocated for. Shortly after the death of George Floyd while in police custody, prominent members of the City Council said they were determined to dismantle the police department. After the council announced it would begin the process of ending the Minneapolis Police Department, several officers resigned. After further resignations, the city's police force now has 200 fewer officers than usual. In addition to all the officers that left the force altogether, 155 remain on an extended leave. Quote, "The mass exodus had much to do with the months of anti-police sentiment and riots, which included the ransacking and burning down of the 3rd Precinct Police Station," end quote, writes Paul Saka for The Blaze. The city now plans to spend $6.4 million to hire and train new police officers after the rash of resignations. City residents begged lawmakers for more police support, citing slower response time to reported crimes and an overall increase in violent crime, while some other residents supported the idea of eliminating the department, claiming the police force is not effective at reducing crime. The City Council is running for political cover because Minneapolis has experienced a dramatic increase in crime since the police defunding movement began. The New York Post editorial board writes, quote, "Months after caving to riotous mobs, the members of the Minneapolis City Council are now complaining about the city's crime surge and insisting they never really meant it when they voted to defund the police department," end quote. The city's crime rates have continued their upward trend in 2021. The number of people wounded by gunshot is up by 250% this year. Rape is up by 22%, and robberies are up by 59% over last year. Sasha Cotton, director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention, said, quote, "Unfortunately, we're following a national trend that no one wants to be a part of," end quote. The Washington Times reports that the police defunding movement has, quote, "exploded in the city's face," end quote. Police Chief Arredondo said, quote, "I have 74 people who are no longer alive in the city because they've been killed. I've got almost 500 people who've been shot and wounded in this city. We can talk about reimagining policing, but I'm talking about what's necessary today and in this city, and we need extra resources," end quote. The good news is it looks like you're going to get extra resources in Minneapolis. More police may be on their way. On the financial front, we're going to have some potential good news for the residents of Kansas. Budget and Tax News reports a proposal to cut Kansas income taxes passed its first vote after the bill's lofty goals of cutting taxes by over $300 million were moderated. Republican legislators in the Kansas Senate Tax Committee narrowed the bill to an approximate $170 million income tax before approving it. The reduction would go into effect during the budget year starting in July. Lawmakers decided a tax cut was appropriate after the federal income tax laws changed in a way that made Kansas's state income tax rise back in 2017. Federal income tax reforms made it more difficult to claim itemized deductions. As it stands in Kansas, residents may not itemize their state returns if they did not do so on their federal returns. The result? Higher state income taxes for Kansans. Michael Austin, director of the Kansas Policy Institute's Sandlian Center for Entrepreneurial Government, said, "It's still early to know in the legislative session to know the exact impact these tax cuts would have, though he expects they'll return at least $100 million back to Kansans." He said, quote, "It's not a massive overhaul like some are saying. It's a modest reform to alleviate some burden on Kansas families," end quote. Democratic Governor Laura Kelly expressed concerns that any tax cuts at this point could undermine COVID-19 recovery. But Austin thinks a tax cut could be beneficial at this time. He said government should take the opportunity to restructure, just as Kansans are having to do with their lives. the government should find a way to cut the budget fat and use those savings to support a tax cut. Austin said, quote, "With the economy faltering under COVID, now more than ever, our elected officials should lift up those who produce goods and services. It's one of the best ways government can also slow out migration and make it easier for those living paycheck to paycheck or for those entering retirement," end quote. Austin said it's likely the governor will veto the tax cut as her agenda includes hikes in spending. But that doesn't mean tax cuts are dead in the water. Austin said about the tax cut, quote, "It creates a unique opportunity for the conservative legislature to rebuke that vision and help Kansans keep more of what they earn," end quote. All right, our next story is from a report from Time Magazine. Time Magazine's Molly Ball revealed influencers of the 2020 election. The Time story explained for more than a year, an alliance of left-wing activists and business titans worked together behind the scenes to ensure that President Donald Trump would lose the 2020 election through a variety of means ranging from changing voting systems and processes to pressuring social media companies to exert their substantial influence. Ball writes, quote, "Their work touched every aspect of the election," end quote. She reported that the architect of the election plan, Mike Podhorzer, spent months talking to experts and organizing an election crisis task force. Fears of COVID-19 provided the perfect opportunity for the task force to implement the plan. Podhorzer began hosting weekly Zoom meetings in April with invited-only coalition members. A significant piece of the plan involved social media. Veteran progressive operative Laura Quinn had been researching online interactions and determined that the more responses to a posting, regardless of its veracity, the more attention it received, as the algorithms promoted what was deemed popular. So she advised the team the solution then was, quote, "pressure platforms to enforce their rules, both by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation and by more aggressively policing it in the first place," end quote. As a result, information and opinions in support of President Donald Trump or the Republican perspective were suppressed as social media giants deplatformed conservative accounts and censored stories deemed negative towards Democrat candidate Joe Biden. Quote, the media relentlessly attacked the Trump campaign," end quote, Jeff Carlson writes for the Epoch Times. Throughout the campaign, Podhorzer warned the teams that President Trump had more support than the public opinion polls were showing. Dr. Richard Ebling, professor of ethics and free enterprise leadership at the Citadel, says Trump would probably have been reelected if not for the manipulation effort. He said, quote, "What was the economic situation as 2019 was ending and 2020 was beginning, before the coronavirus crisis came to the scene? Unemployment overall and for almost every subgroup of the labor force was at the lowest recorded rates in decades. Real income for middle and lower income groups was rising significantly, and GDP was growing at a respectable, if not above average, annual rate. In other words, to the extent that voters voted their pocketbooks, regardless of whether they liked or disliked the personality of the man in the White House, there was a strong probability that Trump would again win the Electoral College, and maybe this time around, even the popular vote," end quote. The death of George Floyd provided another opening, Time reports. Many of the violent mob riots and criminal activities attributed to the George Floyd death were initiated by organizers belonging to Podhorzer's network. Many of these groups were later placed on alert to resurrect the uprising should Trump win the re-election, as Time reports. Ebling said, quote, "The Time article points out that many in the business community were fearful of a repeat of the violent and property-destroying rioting witnessed in the summer of 2020. If Trump won, the radical leftist thugs would be out in force and threaten untold destruction and financial losses to private enterprises. They wanted to guarantee peace from the left by conspiring with them to bring about Trump's defeat, to save themselves from another season of violent love in the streets of American cities," end quote. The article acknowledges that the alliance's control over the rioting by Antifa, BLM, and other violent groups. What is surprising is not that these people conspired to swing the election, but that they openly admit it, says political commentator Jeff Charles. Charles said, quote, "Progressive political operatives, media activists masquerading as objective journalists, Democratic politicians, major corporations, big tech censorship brigades, and many more actively work together to ensure a Biden victory. but nobody could have expected that one of the nation's most prominent publications would put out a piece admitting what most conservatives already knew. A cabal of far-left progressive entities, institutions, and individuals colluded in a comprehensive conspiracy to oust former President Donald Trump during the 2020 election season, end quote. Donald Kendall, a research fellow and co-leader of the Stopping Socialism Project at the Heartland Institute, which publishes budget and tax news, called the project, quote, undeniably sinister, end quote. He said, quote, the Time magazine article is tantamount to an expose revealing the actors who manipulated the election process to ensure Trump's defeat. The actions described in the 6,000-plus word article go beyond fortifying democracy and well into legitimate conspiracy territory, end quote. Ebeling said, quote, the Time article highlights the extent to which the country has degenerated into corruption by the hands of those who are the actual anti-Democrats determined to impose their progressive agenda on all the country by any and all political means. The effectiveness of the election project shows the bankruptcy of far too many in the American business community who are far too often supportive of ideological forces that have the ultimate goal of bringing down capitalism and the idea and ideal of liberty that are the basis of the country's history and material success, end quote. That's it for this week's Heartland View. If you'd like to read further details on these stories, as well as many others, please go to our website, heartlanddailynews.com. And if you support the idea and ideal of liberty, please consider supporting the work of the Heartland Institute. You can find a way to donate on our website, heartland.org. Thank you for your time. Have a great week.